Let me tell you something that genuinely blew my mind when I went back and watched it recently. Constantine currently sits at 46% on Rotten Tomatoes, for a movie that, nearly 2 decades later, has one of the most dedicated cult followings in DC's entire history. That number feels almost offensive. Critics at the time basically called it a generic supernatural action movie dressed up in religious imagery, and audiences weren't exactly lining up either. It made around 230 million on a 100 million budget, which sounds decent until you realize that by 2005 superhero movie standards, that was considered underwhelming. But here's the thing about cult classics. They don't care about opening weekend numbers. So let's start with the original, because you can't understand why this sequel matters without understanding what made the first film special in the first place. Constantine is based on the Hellblazer comics, which themselves started as a spin-off of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, run from the late 80s. The character was famously modeled after the musician Sting. There's even a running joke among comics fans that John Constantine has been accidentally bumping into Sting at parties for 30 years. The Hellblazer series ran for over 300 issues under DC's adult-oriented Vertigo imprint, and it was always a darker, more morally ambiguous corner of the DC universe. Constantine wasn't a superhero, he was a con man, an occultist, a chain smoker who made terrible decisions and somehow kept surviving because the universe hadn't figured out how to fully punish him yet. The adaptation, directed by Francis Lawrence, took that spirit and wrapped it in this gorgeous, grimy Los Angeles noir aesthetic, a city where heaven and hell were running concurrent operations, and the border between them was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. What's fascinating is that Lawrence has openly admitted he would have made a much more intense film had he known from the start they were going to get an R rating. The studio fought for a PG-13, screened it for the ratings board, and got handed an R anyway, which means the version we watched in theaters was actually a more restrained take than what Lawrence had in mind. He's since said that for the sequel, they're fully embracing that rating, leaning into something scarier and more visceral. That alone should get people excited because the original was already pretty dark for a mainstream comic book movie. Imagine what Lawrence does when he's not holding back. Now here's where the timeline gets interesting. The sequel was officially announced in September 2022, when Deadline reported that Reeves and Lawrence were both returning. That sounds recent, but the truth is Reeves has been trying to make this movie for well over a decade. He's talked about it in interviews going back years, and every single time the project would stall out because of some combination of rights issues, competing DC projects, and studio politics. Lawrence explained that they kept getting blocked because Warner Brothers or whoever held the Vertigo rights at any given moment would say they had their own Constantine plans, so the original team couldn't proceed. There was the NBC television series that ran from 2014 to 2015, where Matt Ryan played a version of Constantine that fans actually considered more faithful to the comics. And Ryan ended up carrying that role across multiple Arrowverse appearances and even the Harley Quinn animated series. So for a while, the character was being actively used elsewhere, which made a Reeves-led film sequel essentially impossible to greenlight. The writers' strike in 2023 added another layer of delay, pushing the script development back even further. But around early 2025, things started moving in a way that felt different. Francis Lawrence sat down with Entertainment Weekly and said something he hadn't been able to say before, that he, Reeves, and screenwriter Akiva Goldsman had landed on an idea they all genuinely loved, and that it was being actively developed. Then Keanu himself confirmed that a new draft of the script had come in, and they were taking it to the studio. The project is expected to land under DC's Elseworlds banner, which is essentially DC's way of saying a story exists outside the main continuity of the new DCU James Gunn is building. The Elseworlds label is designed for exactly this kind of darker, standalone material, films that don't need to connect to the broader shared universe and can just be their own thing. Which is the right call. Constantine's world doesn't fit neatly alongside the version of Superman and the Justice League that Gunn is constructing. The tone is completely different, and honestly, that freedom might be what allows the sequel to be genuinely great rather than just serviceable. Peter Stormare, who played Lucifer in the original with that unforgettable mix of calm menace and barely contained chaos, has been one of the more talkative members of the original cast when it comes to the sequel's development. According to him, an early draft of the script was essentially the wrong movie, stuffed full of action set pieces, stunts, and shootouts that belonged in a completely different franchise. Reeves apparently saw that draft and immediately flagged the problem. His whole point was that he'd already made the maximalist action franchise, that's what John Wick is, and Constantine Constantine needed to be something fundamentally different. It needed to stay strange. It needed to keep that philosophical weight, that interrogation of faith and sin, and what it actually means to be a good person when you've seen what waits for you on both sides of the afterlife. This is actually one of the things I respect most about Reeves as a creative force, because he could very easily have taken the money and the recognition that comes with a beloved IP and just delivered a crowd-pleasing action movie. But he's clearly been thinking about this character for 20 years in the back of his mind, the same way Lawrence described it, just letting ideas percolate. The theory I keep coming back to is that Reeves understands Constantine in a fundamentally personal way. John Constantine is a man who can see the true nature of angels and demons, who knows exactly what the spiritual architecture of the universe looks like, and is still somehow cynical about all of it. He's not inspired by what he knows. He's exhausted by it. That's a very specific emotional register that requires a very specific actor, and Reeves is genuinely that actor in a way that no one else has replicated. There are also rumors that Reeves pushed for a bold reimagining of how God is portrayed in the sequel. The idea reportedly being floated is that God would appear in a black suit, carrying the same philosophical ambiguity and quiet menace as Lucifer rather than showing up as some radiant angelic figure handing out divine wisdom. If that's actually in the script, that's a genuinely fascinating creative swing. Here's where I want to get into actual theory territory, because the ending of the first film sets up some very specific dramatic possibilities. At the end of Constantine, Lucifer cures John's cancer as a punishment, not a reward. The logic is devilishly elegant. Constantine had sacrificed himself to save the world, which would have given him immediate entry into heaven. Lucifer couldn't let that happen, so he healed him, dragged him back to Earth, and essentially told him to keep living because eventually he'll screw up again and end up in hell where he belongs. That's the setup for the sequel's entire dramatic engine. Constantine is now a man living under a kind of divine probation. He knows Lucifer is watching, waiting for him to slip. He knows heaven is theoretically available to him if he can hold it together. And he knows that every time he engages with the supernatural, he's walking a razor's edge. My theory is that the sequel will actually explore what happens when that deal starts to complicate itself in ways neither party anticipated. What if Constantine's continued demon hunting, the thing that makes him valuable and arguably righteous, also keeps putting him in situations where he's forced to make morally questionable choices? What if doing the right thing, cosmically speaking, keeps requiring him to do very wrong things on a human level? That's the kind of tragic irony the character was built for, and if God is going to appear in this film, as Stormare suggests, the most dramatically interesting version of that encounter would be one where God's presence raises more questions than it answers. Then there's Gabriel. Tilda Swinton's portrayal of the Archangel in the original is one of those performances that aged into something genuinely iconic. Androgynous, cold, immaculate, and ultimately revealed to be operating from a place of profound resentment toward humanity rather than actual divine purpose. Gabriel hated humans precisely because God loved them. That's a fascinating character to bring back, especially in a story where God himself is supposedly going to appear. How does Gabriel behave in front of the creator she claimed to serve while secretly despising his favorite creation? Swinton has said no one has officially reached out to her about the sequel, which is either an oversight or a very deliberately kept secret. Given how pivotal the character is to the mythology, I find it genuinely hard to believe she wouldn't at least be part of the conversation. Francis Lawrence's career trajectory also suggests the timing could work out. He's coming out of a creatively strong period, The Hunger Games prequel was well received, and has several projects in various stages of development, including I Am Legend 2. But of all of those, Constantine appears to be the one with the clearest path forward right now. I Am Legend 2 has been sitting in a complicated place despite having Will Smith and Michael B. Jordan attached. Constantine, by comparison, has a confirmed star, a script draft that reportedly impressed Reeves, and at least informal conversations with the head of DC Studios. That's actually a lot of pieces in place for a project that still technically hasn't been greenlit. If everything lines up, if Gunn reads the script and responds positively, if the studio puts it on the calendar, you're potentially looking at production beginning sometime in 2026 and a release in 2028. There's a genuine appetite right now for comic book movies that aren't afraid to be weird and dark and specific. The success of stories that operate outside the mainstream superhero template has proven that audiences aren't actually tired of superheroes. They're tired of the same superhero. Constantine was always something different. It was a movie about a man who hated what he knew, who found the universe's greatest secrets to be more burden than gift, who chain-smoked his way through apocalypses and somehow remained the most relatable person in the room. That's a character worth revisiting. That's a character worth getting right. And after 20 years of waiting, the fact that we're this close to seeing Keanu Reeves back in that coat is something worth paying attention to.